Welcome back to my channel. My name is Brian Kafke, and in this video I want to talk to you about why I left Microsoft. But before I begin, please click on the subscribe link that's popping up here. Hopefully I put it in there. Follow that link and then make sure you put on notifications so you can get notified of all my riveting videos that are here to come. So let me jump into why I left Microsoft. Before I do, I want to talk about what my roles were at Microsoft, so you have an understanding of my background and how this led to my fateful decision. So I was a data and AI TSP whose job was to guide customers to the ideal Azure data-centric solution. So that would include anything from things like Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Data Warehouse or Azure SQL Database to things like Azure Data Science solutions like Azure ML and pretty much anything in between, including Databricks and HD Insight. Now I left that after about a year. That was a lot of fun. It was really cool. I decided to make a change, which if you know me from my channel, you know this makes perfect sense. I wanted to go to Worldwide Learning, and I became a content developer for Worldwide Learning for the Data Science Azure certification. So if you've done the DP100 training, it's DP100, the DP100 certification, that was my responsibility, was to develop training around that. And I had to develop the online training content, which you find on Microsoft Learn. And if you haven't looked that up, definitely look at it. It's free. It's called micro-based learning, so it does it in little chunks. It's all kind of cool stuff. You get rewards and trophies and things as you train your way through it, and it's all free, so that's a good price, right? I developed a lot of the content. I don't know how much of it's still with mine. I'm sure people have made changes, but I did the data science related work on that. The other thing I did, of course, was in-person training, which were more full days of training around that as well. And the focus of that training was Azure ML. That was the sole focus. So that's great. And that was really a lot of fun. Now, throughout this process, and one of the reasons I really wanted to go to Microsoft in the first place was I wanted an opportunity to help other people learn about these solutions. And this always is co-joined with my desire to learn as well. So I went to Microsoft partly to just immerse myself in all things Azure. The cloud's the future, and I believe in Azure, so I just immersed myself in Azure, which was great. You know, the great thing at Microsoft is nobody minds when you say, I'm focusing on learning something in Azure. So that was awesome. The other part of it, of course, is I like to train. So one of the things I wanted to do, and I did a lot of, was training all these different areas. So that's what I did at Microsoft. Now, early on, and ironically and fatefully, the first month of my starting at Microsoft, where I was still going through a lot of onboarding things, an announcement was made at a big conference called Ignite. And it was a joint project, or a joint project really between Microsoft and a company called Databricks. If you've heard of Apache Spark, two of the developers of Apache Spark founded a company called Databricks, and I'll talk more about what Databricks is, but this was a first-class service that took about a year of Microsoft engineers working with Databricks engineers to really integrate Azure with Databricks. Now, in summary, Azure Databricks is a first-class Azure-based user interface around Apache Spark. It's a mouthful. It's a big data and AI tool on Azure as a first-class service, and this got me really excited. Now, it's easy to set up. Having been someone who tried to use Hadoop MapReduce years earlier and found this was on-premise, really a pain to set up. You couldn't really scale it very well because it was limited to whatever resources you had available to the service, etc. This was like within minutes, I'm up and running. So I'm learning about Azure, and I said, oh, let me play with this. Within minutes, I'm up and running, and this thing is amazing. And I was so impressed with it that I became obsessed. And anyone at Microsoft would agree with that. I became obsessed over Databricks, Azure Databricks specifically. I love that it can also scale up and down. So in other words, you can say, give me 2 to 2,000 virtual machines or nodes in my cluster, and you determine, based on how much I throw at you, how to scale that up and down, and I only pay for what's being used. And by the way, if I'm not using clusters for 20 minutes, shut it down. Or better yet, I'm going to schedule a job, create a cluster when I need it, and get rid of the cluster, and I'm done. So that ability to really scale well was impressive because it really minimizes costs. Now, since I'm very big on data science and data engineering pipelines that lead to data science, I was really excited about the way that this service is primarily and ideally suited for a data science team collaboration environment. You think the full team, the data scientists, the data engineers, database people, domain experts, that kind of thing, and they all have to share and collaborate. It's ideal for that. It's got all the tools and services that make that ideal. Strong security as well, and then tight integration with Azure, which obviously goes hand in hand, using Active Directory and ways to secure things. And I was really impressed with how it could connect and use Azure Blob Storage, Azure Data Lake, etc., on and on. So I became obsessed and really excited about Azure Databricks. But as I started trying to learn more about it and really master this tool, I was shocked to find I buy lots of books. There are no comprehensive books available on Databricks. Not just Azure Databricks, but Databricks at all. And that was very frustrating to me because I typically like to get a book, step through it, and then I learn it. My videos, I will confess. Ask me any of those videos what I based it on, and it'll be different books that I usually have around my desk. It's like, yeah, that was the PySpark book. Oh, yeah, that was the SQLite book or whatever. But there's nothing here, so I had to say, okay, I'm stuck with only online documentation. Okay, great. Now I'm stuck with multiple sets of online documentation. This is no fault at all of Microsoft or Databricks. It's just that Azure Databricks became a sort of new animal in the ecosystem. And prior to this, Databricks was primarily an AWS service, and it wasn't really tightly integrated on AWS. So when Microsoft and Databricks did this sort of joint venture, they also created an entirely new set of parallel documentation focused on Azure, which can lead to confusion. And sometimes the documentation is out of date, etc., which is inevitable in any online documentation. There's also very few code examples. A lot of times in the Databricks documentation, again, I'm not criticizing, but I work off code examples. Telling me what parameters are there and then describing them, to me, doesn't help unless I see a string. Like, here's the function call, here's the values, here's an actual example of how to connect to Azure SQL database or something. And I found very few code examples. And of course, any code examples you do find have to be Databricks notebooks. That's the IDE of Databricks, so not many available. Another big challenge. So I got in there and I started learning from the online documentation what I could and piece things together. But how do I learn how to use Python, i.e. PySpark, or R, which includes Spark R and Sparkly R? How do I use those? Turns out that those are actually not part of Databricks. Those are just part of the larger Spark ecosystem. In other words, Apache Spark there are developers who specifically focused on developing a good interface to Spark called PySpark. Those are Python developers, it's separate, and it has its own set of documentation. And the same is true of R and whatever other languages come along. So what does that mean for you trying to learn? Well, it generally means that you're not going to want to rely exclusively on Databricks documentation to learn those things. It took me a while to realize I had to go to the open source documentation, and then I learned something really important. Spark is Spark. I can't say it's a terrible word. I wish they didn't call it Spark with the Boston accent, but Spark is at the end Spark, and Databricks is riding on Spark. The takeaway is that the documentation and books available that talk about PySpark and Sparkly R and stuff work perfectly in Databricks. However, do you want to have to go and get all those books and start studying each one separately? I'm guessing no, but I did that. That's what I ended up doing, was researching each one individually and learning how to get up to speed. Finally, what about Azure? Now, the documentation is pretty good about talking about some of the areas you can interface with Azure, but I still found it lacking in good code examples and explaining some of the nuances, like how do I really secure, when I'm using blob storage, how do I secure that? How about Azure Data Lake Storage? Can I set up service principals and on and on? How do I do things? Not so easy to get that information. It's very piecemeal. Solution, and this is why I left Microsoft. At the end of the day, I decided, as much as it was great at Microsoft, I just had this drive. I was too fascinated and riveted with Databricks, and I couldn't focus really on many other topics at that point. I wasn't, as much as I liked some of the other stuff going on, I wanted to really focus on Databricks. I wanted to learn it inside and out myself, so I could not only use it myself, but also so I could teach other people how to use this tool. So I wrote this book called Master Azure Databricks, and after leaving Microsoft, I spent the last over 9 months just writing this book. Now remember, it is an Apache Spark-based service, so one of the benefits of learning this myself and then writing it in the book is most of what I write applies to Apache Spark. It's a comprehensive resource. The thing that you'll notice I said was lacking. This is a comprehensive resource. Takes you from beginner to expert, but it's also a good expert resource. If you're an expert and you say, I don't need this, I guarantee there'll be things in this book you didn't know. I hope so. And if that's not true, reach out to me and I'll try to find something that you didn't know. But I think it is true. There's things that as an expert you tend to focus on what you use on your job, and there may be things you didn't realize were available there. It's a step-by-step case. I find when I learned Azure Analysis Services, when I learned SQL Server Analysis Services years ago, I got a BI step-by-step book where I had screenshots and said, do this, do this, do this. So it gives you the concepts and then walks you through it. And I find that's the best way to learn, especially in something that is a very UI-centric service. So let me tell you what's covered in the book, so you'll have an idea of like whether or not it fits for you or whether you're interested. But one of the most underrated parts of Databricks, the thing that ironically Databricks themselves don't give a lot of attention to, and it's a disservice to how powerful it is, which is the notebooks themselves. Notebooks are incredibly powerful in Databricks, and in my opinion, it's the thing I love about Databricks the most because it's a great IDE. It's much more powerful than Jupyter Notebooks. It has the ability to create interactive visualizations with no code, but not just for stuff that's done with Databricks, but also for Python and stuff you can play with data sets coming back and do visuals without writing any code, which I like. It also supports slicing and dicing and filtering through something called widgets. So you can create widgets. Again, it's a little bit like Jupyter widgets, but better, I think, more flexible. And you can create dashboards. So in a nutshell, if you look at those things, it's kind of Power BI, right? Now, it's not as elaborate as Power BI. Power BI has so many extensions and all kinds of services, but it could be used as a substitute for Power BI dashboards and things, especially for internal usage, like on a project. So I'm really impressed with that, and I cover that in great detail. Something you may not also know, but the most important language on Apache Spark is SQL, Structured Query Language. From the old database world, yes. The Spark developers realized not all that long ago that SQL solved a lot of critical problems, performance tuning and data engineering, the ability to write expressive queries, and so Spark SQL is the most important language in Spark. So I cover that in a great deal of depth, and if you know SQL, then you may be really interested in reading my book for that section because it covers a lot of it, and you'll learn just how much you can leverage your knowledge to be into the current world on the cloud and with Spark. The most popular language on Spark is Python. And Python is able to work with Spark through a package called PySpark. So I go into a lot of detail on PySpark. How do we do exploratory data analysis with PySpark? How do I write user-defined functions and all kinds of extensions? A lot of detail, a lot of depth. I wanted to do the grunt work so you don't have to, and I think it's a great chapter. I covered that in as much detail as I thought was possible without, I also cover R. Now, R is the confusing one. R is one of my soft spots. I love the language. I think it's amazing. But it was confusing to me when I started how to use R with Spark. Now, there are actually two competing packages, and I talk about both, and I compare them and tell you how to use both and where the strengths and weaknesses are. So Spark R and Sparkly R. Scala is what Spark is written in, and as a result, I also talk about Scala, when you want to use it, when not to use it, pros and cons, and get into these things. Now, talking about these languages, I should let you know, the book can only do so much, so I cannot step backwards and teach you the basics of Python or SQL or things like that. So my recommendation is if you don't know those, but you would like to benefit from those chapters, then brush up on the language of choice. A lot of people do know SQL, so that may be less of an issue, but if you want to get value out of PySpark, then get some other book that supports training on PySpark. I actually like Python Crash Course, is pretty good if you don't know Python at all. And there's another one that's Python for Data Analysis, which is good for just background and doing data analysis. Those will transfer very nicely to these things. And again, R as well. The other thing that I do as I build towards this is integrating with Azure Storage. So there's a lot of options and service things that go with Azure Storage, and it's confusing to the beginner. You have blob storage, file storage, you have tables, you have queues, you have all kinds of different things. What should you use? How do you use it? How do you secure it? Those are things I talk about, even including Azure Data Lake Gen Store 2, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, all there. The other thing, as a data engineer going way back, the thing I find is I have to use different types of data sources, and very often I get confused on, okay, how do I read JSON and query and filter in JSON? How do I make use of legacy mainframe files that are fixed length records with fixed length columns? How do I parse that in something, in a tool that doesn't have that kind of structure? So I go into that, XML and JSON and all these different types of file formats, and even Azure SQL database and how to use ODBC with it, etc. So I get into all those things. And I build through a combination. So this is very layered. It starts at the basics, you don't know anything, and builds. At the final chapter, I go into a good deal of coverage on how to build machine learning pipelines, train a predictive model, in particular with train models in Spark, which is Databricks again, so Spark. But I also go into how to extend that functionality to use an open source package in Spark called MLflow, which is designed to monitor, track, and automate, operationalize, if you will, machine learning pipelines. Now, parallel to that is a service that Microsoft has, which, of course, from my training background, I knew quite well, Azure ML, Azure Machine Learning, which is really an overlap. So you wouldn't typically use both, so I cover them separately. Here's how I use MLflow, here's how I use Azure ML. If you've used machine learning training with Power BI or any number of other services, even Dynamics, at the end in the background, it's using Azure ML. It's kind of this backbone service that everything hooks into. So I show you how to do that in the book. I also give you complete working Databricks notebooks and sample files. Sample files. So it's very much like you can just take the notebooks and they're marked so that they align with what the book covers. So you can say, oh, okay, let me run this. Okay, let me run this. You can type in the code if you want. I have everything also in screenshots. But if you'd rather, and I recommend, I'm too lazy to type all that in by hand, and I'm likely to make mistakes, you can just follow through with the notebooks and see what they're doing, make changes as you need to your environment. Now, this book is ideally targeted towards beginners on Databricks and Spark, but it's also good for newbies, people who, I see a lot of people out there who just want to ramp up and get up to speed with the latest technology so their skills are ready to take them into the future. So it's really good for those people too. In other words, you don't have to be somebody who's going to be using Databricks right away. You can learn it and be ready for those interview questions. It's also great for the experienced Databricks people. I know that may sound strange, but I encourage them to take a look because it does have a lot of stuff that I've never had anyone talk to me about. And I talked to a lot of Databricks people, so I think it's got a lot of interesting things that you can learn. And Spark devs. There's a lot of Spark developers. I spoke at the Apache Spark, the Spark AI conference last year, and I found a lot of people at that conference. I had a very popular room filled with people who didn't know how to use, for instance, Spark R. So I know Spark devs could benefit from this coverage. So these are the target audience. Best of all, it's available now on Amazon, so just look it up under Master Azure Databricks or Azure Databricks. Look it up under my name. I put a link in here, but I don't like to put links. You won't be, that kind of thing. Just go find it. Okay, so wrapping up. I want to thank you for listening. Now you know why I left Microsoft. I know there's no horror stories. It's just, it's the truth of why I made the fateful decision. And I'm really excited I did. It was a huge amount of work. I don't know if I would even do it again if I knew how much work I was getting myself into, but I hope it's good. I hope people get a lot of value out of it. That's my number one objective here. And honestly, I want to help advance Databricks, Spark, and the open source world because I think the stuff is great. So please, again, you're going to see some links pop up. So if you don't, when you do, if you see my face, you can just click on my face at the end of this and then subscribe. Make sure you turn on notifications and let people know about this. Let people know about the book. I'm really excited. Thank you.